the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we have observed his star in its rising, and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for as it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of all Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is shepherd to my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me words that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen in its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is God's good word for us, God's beloved people. Thanks be to God. Amen. So, I was off for a little over a week, and so I had more than a normal allotment of time to sit and do nothing on the internet. And I stumbled across one of these articles that's deliberately written to get your attention and activate some weird part of your lizard brain. It was like, if you're a Gen Xer, you'll remember these things and no one else will. I'm not a Gen Xer, I'm a little younger than them, but I have some memories of what life was like in a pre-internet world, and so I clicked this thing. And the whole point was, modern conveniences have completely replaced a few very specific problems that used to be major social concerns. And the one that really got to me was coordinating arriving at a place. Coordinating arriving at a place with modern information technology is a fundamentally solved problem. I GPS track my wife. I GPS track my Uber driver. I GPS track the food arriving at my house. When given the opportunity, I will GPS track my children. If I am trying to meet up with someone who I am not actively GPS tracking, I can text them and ask them where they are. I can call them and ask them where they are. I can call every person they've ever known to find out where they might be. Because I have the equivalent of a 1980s supercomputer connected to a network of satellites in my pocket. I never knew a world, really, where I had to meet up with people socially in a world before cell phones. I got my first phone when I was 14, just as I was starting to hang out with people outside of my house. And so I don't actually know the payphone dance of you told your friend you were going to meet at the mall, but then maybe you're late, maybe they're late, then you have to leave the meeting spot and go to a payphone and then have change and then call them and then maybe go back, but maybe you missed them in some sort of Scooby-Doo or vaudevillian-esque, just missing one another comedy bit. I didn't actually live in that world, but I can conceptualize that world, because for me it was waiting for my mom to pick me up from school. I went to kinds of schools that didn't have school buses, and so I would have to sit there, just, the front porch of my school, waiting for my mother to arrive. And because of the vicissitudes of modern life, because of Houston traffic, because she worked a good chunk of my adolescence, she was not always exactly on time. Not particularly late, just there's variance. But I had no idea when she was going to arrive. And I had no way of contacting her, and I had never even heard of GPS when I was 10. And so I'd have to sit there and wait and look at the exact spot where I knew her car would come from, and wait. And then the twice, this not happened regularly, but the twice it happened where something weird happened and she couldn't get there right on time, and I had to go back into the school and call on the school phone. These are problems that are fundamentally gone. We don't deal with them. We carry satellite-connected supercomputers in our pockets and purses. And we take for granted that world is gone. I don't miss that world. But I take for granted that I can just contact anyone I want at any time and find out where they are and when they're going to be where I am. The other one that catches me out more than it should is paper money. Right? Paper money, certainly in the developed half of the world, is just not really a thing. I can pay with my watch. I can pay with the satellite-connected supercomputer. I can pay with a info-connected piece of plastic that lives in my wallet. I almost never need cash, to the point where I don't carry cash, to the point where the handful of times in modern life where I need cash, I'm kind of, well, you're not getting my money. But where it really got me was when I lived in Kenya and lived on there were only two ways to pay people. It was either with cash or with essentially cell phone points. It was very strange. But debit cards, Amexes didn't work in Kitui County, Kenya. And what banks did take my debit card, it stopped working because my debit card expired while I was there. And obviously, Wells Fargo wasn't going to send me my new debit card to Kenya. And so then, not only did I was having to pay in cash, I didn't have any ability to get more cash, and I became reliant on Western Union. It was very strange. It was this whole other world that me as a modern person living in 2012 had never really experienced what it was to live off of Western Union, because I had always had, as long as I had a bank account, I had always had a debit card. You take for granted that world is gone until you come face to face with very odd cases where that world still exists. But when it becomes essentially the water that we swim in, a great leap forward, a great innovation, a great change in the structure of society can just become commonplace, to the point where we can take it for granted. Certainly, I take for granted that I can GPS track the people in my life that I need to meet up with and can always get there. But even 15 years ago, 25 years ago, that was not the world. And I take for granted that I can just pay with a little bit of plastic or the supercomputer in my pocket. And I take that great stride, change, shift in society for granted. As I think about the story of the wise men, I don't want us to take for granted the great leap forward that this represents. We tell this story as the tacked-on detail for Christmas, and I have to do the gotcha questions, pop quiz. How many magi were there? How many? Doesn't say. There are 3 gifts. We don't know. The 3 wise men, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, great names. Not in the text, right? We've added a lot. Just like the donkey, just like the innkeeper, no donkey, no innkeeper, unknown number of wise men, unlikely to have been 3. That's way too small a number of people to have made that long a trek, right? They traveled 1,000 miles in the 1st century. Were there camels? Not in the Bible. Likely, right? But we don't actually know. The camels do not feature. They're just a very common beast of burden in that part of the world. No camels, unknown number. But our friends of the wise men, right? Some magi, so we know more than 1, probably more than 2, so at least 3, but likely far more than 3. This is the story tacked on at the end of Christmas. This gives us another detail, and it gives us some gifts, and so it gives us some more props and some more characters to the Christmas play, and then 2 to 3 people can play a camel if you really think about how you can structure a camel costume. But actually, for us as Gentile Christians, which is, I understand, the vast majority of Christians, but it really is relevant here, this is a giant leap forward. One, these guys are Gentiles. This sounds obvious, but is an important point, that now Gentiles are seeking out God and being welcomed into the fold. This is new. This is headline news. This is an innovation. This is a change that comes with Christ. This is setting up the whole arc of the New Testament in a real way, is an understanding that God's love is not for a small group, it is for all people. And by the way, these particular guys accentuate that in a couple of ways. One, they are priests of another religion, right? Magi, wise men, we believe that they are Zoroastrian priests. And so they, Zoroastrian priests, are not only seeking out God, but having this profound religious experience and encountering Christ. Picking up upon their arrival in verse 11. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They worship. These Zoroastrian priests, these Gentiles, these highly unlikely to have sought out the King of the Jews, instead travel 1,000 miles across great difficulty to worship Christ, to experience that moment, to offer the best of what they had for Christ, the gifts worthy of a king, to this baby. Then there's the other piece of it, that they are the least likely to be welcomed, because we don't hear it, because we don't think in geography in this way. But if they came from the east, that means they came from Persia, modern-day Iran and Iraq. Persia had a different name a few hundred years ago, a few hundred years before this story. It was Babylon. These are some Babylonian dudes, the people who had, the evil empire who had taken God's people into exile, the last evil empire to knock over the temple. I understand the temple's about to get knocked over again by the Romans, but we've always known the Romans are evil. That's what Holy Week's about. This is the previous iteration of the evil empire, sending out priests who are being transformed by the love of God. It is a profound transformation. That anyone is welcome. That this love is for any who seek it. Even priests of another religion from the former enemy nation who knocked down the temple and took God's people into exile. Even their representatives will be welcomed at the feet of Christ. We should never take this for granted. This is a change. This is a change we've become accustomed to because it's just the waters of the tank that we live in, right? We're like the fish, right? You put the fish in the bag and slowly the fish becomes acclimatized to the tank. We've become too acclimatized to this tank to understand how miraculous this tank we live in actually is. That any who seek the feet of Christ will be welcomed there, including the enemy priests can come, can worship, can be transformed. There's an important coda to think about this scripture. Why is this story in Matthew? Matthew is writing to a predominantly, but not exclusively, Jewish Christian congregation. If we think of Luke as the writer for the Paul movement, as we think of Mark writing, being briefly specific, if we think about John writing for philosophical Greeks, we think about Matthew writing for a congregation that is predominantly Jewish Christian, but not exclusively. There are both Jewish and Gentile Christians in the mix in his congregation, and he is writing for a specific community. Whether it's one church or a network of churches, don't get too specific. We don't know. But it is a specific enough group that we can think about. Matthew wants to say specific things to his group of folks. And it is interesting that Matthew spends much more time showing how the Pharisees are hypocrites, for instance, spends much more time talking about what it is to be persecuted by those who should be with you. And it is because they have run into resistance by the local synagogue, that what were family and friends are now enemies may be too strong a word, but certainly applying negative social pressure to God's people, right? Why does Matthew make sure to draw out this story of Gentiles showing up and being welcome? It's because Matthew sees what's happening, right? And what is happening into Matthew's community is also happening here in Matthew chapter 2. Herod, one of the great Jewish leaders, not only rejects Christ, in the next verse is going to try and kill him. Right? The slaughter of the innocents is next. The slaughter of the innocents and the escape to Egypt picks up in verse 13 of chapter 2. Right? The next verse, Herod's going to try. This joke about homage, I say homage like a mob boss every time. Go and pay him homage. It's because I once wrote a play about this, and I cast Herod as a mob boss. I designed the character of Herod to be the wise men were in a 1940s detective, and Herod was a 1940s mob boss. Yeah, we'll go pay him homage. It's going to kill him. That not everyone who should know how good God is going to know that. And some people who definitely shouldn't know how good God is are going to know that. Matthew is watching the very early version of this play out in his own community, where some who have known God their whole lives are not going to hop on board with what is happening. And some people who have never known God are going to be so utterly transformed by this new movement in their lives. Friends, I invite us in this year, perhaps as any year, but certainly in this year, to not take for granted what we really have. The profound nature of what we really have. That no matter who we are welcome at the feet of Christ. And whether you are the most likely to know the love of God, or the least likely to know the love of God, you can know the love of God. This is the promise of Christmas. The promise shared with us. Paul spends a lot of time in the book of Romans breaking down exactly how this works, but essentially, we too get to be a part of all of God's promises. God's promises are our promises. No matter who we are, what we've done, where we're from, none of that matters. Let's not take that for granted. Let's see how miraculous it truly is. See how profound that truly is. See how wonderful that truly is. That babe lying in a manger. He's in a house now, but welcomes you, me, anybody, to come and be a part of his promise, his salvation, his transformation, of his love, his hope, his peace.